Hello and welcome everyone to today's learning session. Really excited to have you here with us today. We're going to focus a little bit on the job placement metrics and how to set up programs so that military connected students attending your university end up with positive job outcomes that make a difference in the real world. So, very excited to have an awesome panelist with us today. It is not his first time with us, and we are super excited to have him back. He is a wealth of knowledge. Welcome, JD.
Thank you so much, Kayla. It's always a pleasure to not only be with colleagues, but like-minded colleagues as well. So it's an absolutely honor to be a part of this conversation.
Thanks, JD. We're excited to have you. So, JD is the executive director for the Center of Military Transition at the Mason School of Business at William and Mary. He's a 20-year U.S. Army vet and an officer. And in 2024, JD was named the Hoover Veteran Fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institute. Congratulations. Tell us a little bit about yourself, JD.
Absolutely. As you just sort of outlined there, I carry a couple of titles, a couple of experiences with me, which are all sort of a part of my identity as well as what I do. But more than anything, I view it as a bit of both my role as well as my mission to really focus on connection, right? Whether that's connection through relationships, whether that's connection through institutions, but really with a focus on student veterans as well as transitioning service members that are really looking for different avenues to be able to really empower that transition. So it's absolutely transformational. A little bit of that was a result of my own transition. Like so many, when it was time for me to depart uniform service, I felt a little bit lost, right? A lot of the conversations that I had really weren't meaningful in the fact that truly sort of empowered me to ask the right questions as well as then reflect on what those questions might mean for me personally. And then after that reflection, actually connect with folks to be able to explore different aspects. I was fortunate that my first role after the Army was with the Pat Tillman Foundation, a stalwart in the veteran empowerment space that focuses heavily on education as a nonprofit. But more than anything, it was an organization that sought to connect as well as empower like-minded veterans that thought their best years of service lie in front of them, informed by what came before, right? Empowered by what came before, but then also mixed with world-class educational opportunities and real connections to really allow veterans to flourish in a new chapter of service. And those experiences, my own transition experience in that time with the Tillman Foundation, really for me um, helps me when I'm working with student veterans and connecting like really intentional through lines from the time somebody is an applicant until not only when they're hired, but then extending that through line even to make sure that they have the right tools, resources, and empowerment to continue to progress, to be promoted, to find not just a job, but a meaningful, again, new chapter of service. So that is probably the best way to sort of describe what I do while simultaneously emphasizing sort of who I am.
Nice. And you were the perfect one for this conversation. So, I want to talk a little bit about the reverse engineering of the corporate landscape, right? And how that impacts the education pathway. Most institutions nowadays really build that academic curricula around faculty expertise. But schools that really dominate the graduation career outcome category of the military friendly survey do the exact opposite, right? They're looking at real world and what that need is in the future landscape. So, how does your institution actively gain workforce data from top employers so that you can back engineer your degree programs, even before you start marketing those programs to veterans or
Right.
military students?
Yeah, it's an extraordinarily, I think, important question, and I really like this framework that you've offered here too, in terms of this notion of reverse engineering. And more than anything, I think it starts with some attitudes, right? Attitudes from leadership, right? And for us, we're fortunate that the dean of our business school, one of his primary principles is actually how can we bring business to the business school. And I think that attitude and that mindset is an important way to establish some of the connections so that we understand, even in a very fluid, dynamic, I would dare say even turbulent labor market, right, in terms of white collar managerial type work, as fluid and as turbulent as that might be right now, we have to try to be as responsive as possible. Now, at the same time, as in any institution of higher education, the faculty are going to have a vote too. And they should, to be able to exercise both their academic freedom as well as then the depth of expertise that they provide. But the combination of, I think, senior leadership mindset that I just mentioned, as well as that faculty expertise, is really where things come together. So a great example of what we use is really sort of one of the key pillars of our second year MBA experience. There's actually two key pillars, each of them sort of aligned to different sort of industries. One is what's called a Batten Fund, and it's named after a benefactor that actually allows our students that are specializing in financial analysis to conduct real world financial and investment analysis. They have actual real funds that then drive their research, that is investing these funds, and a part of their grade actually comes a little bit on that return of investment that's there. But I think that's one example in a specific industry that then is managed by one of our best and most popular with the students and the student veterans, one of our best professors. And so as they are proceeding through that course, there's a little bit of lecture, but there's a lot of actual work that replicates what those financial analysts would actually be doing 6 months, 18 months in the future. And the particular professors that manage that course are really intentional about bringing in alumni that are several years down the road to be able to, again, have a relational aspect to that. Likewise, on the consulting side, another one of William & Mary's particular strengths, we have what's called our corporate field consultancy course. And these are real world paying clients that pay the business school for second MBA year students to work in teams on real world consulting projects, right? So then they're dealing with the actual realities that means something, right? You know, you can go into a consulting class and understand you have some facts, you have some assumptions, but what then happens when the client might not be sharing all the facts that you need to answer the question that they want? That's a realistic sort of challenge that folks have in the consulting field, and to be able to integrate that intentionally with faculty buy-in is one of the key things of what we do on that as well. And that's just on the learning side. There's even more that we can do in terms of just pure interview feedback when those students are actually going through the interview process, some of which we collect from the students themselves. But then we're also going into alumni, to hiring managers, to other institutional relationships that we've been able to develop. Just yesterday, I got an email from a very close partner that was outlining the fact that he understands what the MBA program does, because the students are answering very evocatively what they have been doing. But then a shortcoming for us that he identified and helped us to identify was the fact when he asked the question, well, what do you want to do after this MBA program? That those questions and those responses that those questions were generating had a little bit less quality. So again, that's a wonderful sort of spot that we are able to immediately bring into our next orientation period as we're about to start this process all over again. So again, it's a combination of dean-based leadership, faculty buy-in, and then institutional relationships that really, again, allow us to look into the future and then reverse engineering what skills are actually out there as well.
Absolutely. You know, and it's fantastic that you have such an open communication string between all levels of, of the organization. Within the military friendly survey, there's six metric benchmarks, and you have to meet three of those four. One of which is the job placement rate, which is why we're talking today, right? And that minimum benchmark is 50%. Now, you're in a unique situation, right? Because your dean's very open to communication. But for those out there, with the landscape being so competitive as it is, right? And student attraction, you have to figure out how to set your university ahead of others. So how do you recommend that individuals who maybe don't have as supportive of a feedback loop create that feedback loop between their campus career office, between the strategic leadership at the university to admissions or even support.
Yeah, I think what in that question you outlined some of the key elements of what I would actually sort of try to align in terms of different nodes that are going to vary from institution to institution. One of the techniques that we have found is actually sometimes starting broadly. Um, just about 18 months ago, the World Economic Forum outlined a series of core skills and emerging skills, and they sort of titled it the core skills of 2030. And so these are actual skills from an established group of experts, right, that are saying these are the skills and capabilities that employers are going to want to see. And taking that sort of external established reference point, I think, is a really good way to then start to have some really important conversations actually with members of the admissions team, right? So then a career services team has an external data point, an external frame of reference that they are then using to categorize admissions essays, right? I think that's a first question that is an interesting question for a career services professional to ask. What are the actual admissions essays that can outline elements of previous experience, strength, interest, motivation that could then, from the very, very beginning of day zero or even before day zero, really accelerate the sort of conversations of how can a particular academic course of work start to support where somebody wants to go in the future, and then keeping it well framed with an external sort of established piece. And then that allows for some very specific data input points that can come from alumni, again, recruiters, as well as in corporations. But that approach of those different nodes actually lets you get a little bit deeper than just some of those recruiters as well. And I think that's an interesting way of what we sort of experiment each year, of taking real sort of detailed information about individuals that the admissions team is the experts on before they get here, and try to share that sort of insight as rapidly as possible.
Absolutely. Are there any additional ways that you can think of, at the top of your head that help you stay ahead of your peers when it comes to student attraction, leveraging job placement?
Yeah, one of the things that we've actually started to do is as we go out to different regional sort of corporations, and this is, I think, very specific to the veteran space, is that we're starting to go out to them and try to have more robust conversations. Typically, in the career services and sort of employer engagement realm, academic institutions are going to employers of like, hey, who can you hire? We are starting to do some additional sort of analysis to say not only who might be interested that could be a good fit in this organization, but then also starting to invite some of their current employees into our non-residential programs, whether it's our part-time MBA program that meets on campus, but it's at night, whether it's our online program. So it's a little bit more of an offer first and a request second that we're starting to find is opening up some of those corporate sort of conversations that are there. And then those conversations just lead to relationships. Those relationships lead to actual opportunities to have value alignment. And it's not just, it makes it just less of a transactional ask on that. And then there's based off those relationships, which can be further deepened by alumni. And again, I think the best place to start are some of those corporations where you have natural sort of trends that are already established. You actually just have a much more robust and sort of three-dimensional picture of what that organization's need is. And then you're talking about, hey, if this is the need, or if these are the skills and the capabilities you want, these are how we can start to shift electives and special sort of topics in terms of our education to build those skills, to build those capabilities, and then to coach the storytelling around all of that to, again, make a much more robust sort of through line from the time someone's an applicant all the way until they're an alumni, and invite them all to those conversations.
Absolutely. And so in previous webinars and sometimes when we connect with our audience base, we always mention something called corporate espionage, right? And so that's a lot of what you're talking about, which is doing your own research to go out there and find out not just who's a fit, it's more how can we fit, right?
Right.
And how can they fit back? And So when it comes to that intelligence gathering, you mentioned the World Economic Forum as a good place to look for skills. We also have the Military Friendly Employers survey, which ends up
Mhm.
producing a list called the Top Degrees List and Top Jobs List. That's actually taken from real life data that companies are submitting that they have the highest need for hires in. And so when you're looking at some of the shortfalls, right, that maybe an enrollment manager may uncover, as far as recruiting is concerned, how do you recommend that they can get ahead of their competitors? And I know this is
Yeah,
similar to the last question, but a little different when we focus specifically on enrollment management.
yeah, and you're talking about enrollment management on the way into the institution, correct? Yeah, um, I think one of the best ways to look at that is again, as you sort of outlined, a little bit of a multi-layered approach, and it also is a key element that sort of comes into that enrollment managers really deep and intimate knowledge of the actual sort of academic program of instruction that's there too, right? That again, sometimes I think we put too much emphasis on like the career advisor, on that midpoint to the end point of like the sort of transition journey throughout higher education, as they're the one that needs to help a student veteran and empower that student veteran to put all the pieces together. I think if you start to take that question of how do all these pieces fit, and actually when the enrollment manager is looking at that, that's actually, I think, absolutely critical because that enrollment manager, again, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, they're the first person to sort of see, okay, where are some of these strengths that exist? They see that early resume that's a part of the application. Importantly, they see some of the words and the logic, and in many cases, the passion that comes out of those admission essays. That I think is sometimes overlooked because the enrollment manager's actually dealing with the near term problem, right? It's too siloed of a problem statement of how can I find the best applicant to enroll, to shift that question for that enrollment management.
Technical difficulties. So my next question to you is, and this might be a tough one, right? So when it comes to the internal dialogue that you're having, that may be a little bit more challenging when some of the deans don't see things the same way, or professors may not see things the same way. How do you reveal, right, what that legacy degree program is it might be lacking, or that is not offering, or that doesn't quite align with what corporate America is telling you that they're looking for?
Yeah, in the great sort of classic tradition of higher education, we sort of deal with that with the committee, right? And again, that can bounce both ways, but we really are intentional about asking those questions of what are skills and capability gaps that employers and markets and industries are seeing, and how can we help to sort of fill those gaps, and where is our sort of faculty expertise and sort of our traditional expertise? Where does that fit in? Where does that fit in as well? Interestingly enough, again, based off the leadership at the very top of the business school, I, as sort of like the military and veteran sort of subject matter expert in the Mason School, I'm actually a part of some of those redesign processes that we look to do every few years. So I'm an ex officio member of a faculty-led committee that's asking the question of what does management and industry need in terms of specific skills that are there. And also as a part of that conversation, our dean of admissions is a part of that conversation. Faculty members from each of our different sort of academic departments and specialties are a part of that conversation, as well as an experts in the career services piece as well. So again, I think it's sort of a collective um, elements of brainstorming that moves as rapidly as we can to make different adjustments within the curriculum that's there too. As well as then, I think one of the key things that we're the beneficiary of is hindsight of some of our predecessors that again followed this intent to bring business into the business school. So even if a course might have the same title for quite a bit, if that course over the duration of a semester, every other week is bringing in an industry partner and a CEO. That is, I think, a good way to make it as real and as responsive as possible.
Absolutely. And the committee approach is so beneficial, right? You have a million different aspects coming in, different point of views, different voices. But another thing that you mentioned was that you have a pretty robust feedback circle when it comes to your
Mhm.
partner network, alumni network, and student network. And so I would encourage all of the all of the schools that are with us today to make sure that you incorporate that into your advisory committee, right? Whether you're having feedback surveys or you're just gathering information, or they are anonymous feedbacks, that you bring that back to the committee so that there is external perspective, in addition to all of the different voices that you have within the university. Um,
I'd agree with that, Kayla. The other piece that it allows you to do is that often I think a lot of the surveys, um, you're looking at quantifiable metrics, which is really, really important. But then there's this other aspect, particularly when you're looking at individual growth and individual connection, that some of the qualitative feedback that you can get is really, really critical. From students, the students that interview, we sort of do a little bit of a debrief with each of them. So we know company X is asking these sort of like 8 questions for this type of role, right? And looking at qualitatively, just looking at the language that's used in those questions can not only prepare the next round of students that are going to go for those interviews in terms of the mock interview preparation, but then when faculty as well as administrators are looking at what that company is asking for, that's a good way to again confirm some of the different sort of skills and capabilities that they're looking for as well. So again, that there's a couple of elements of duality and layers that you can add on to that committees such as that can, when done right, can be really, really important in providing some interesting as well as transformative insights.
Absolutely. So that military students bring a different perspective into the landscape, right? They've already had real world experience and then they're coming into the classroom environment. So I want to talk a little bit on our next topic, which is the transition from the military career landscape into that educational path and how we can leverage that into career mapping. Sometimes it's not always a one-to-one, right? There's not always an MOS that directly aligns with a civilian career, or they just may not want to pursue that same MOS in their civilian career. And so institutions that take that into consideration may ask an MOS code, right? Or may want to know what they previously did in the military. But the ones that are doing it really well are the ones that are taking a detailed look at the JST, or the Joint Service Transcript, which is basically like a record of training and experience, and jobs that you've done, and roles and responsibilities that you've done when you were in the military, and bringing that into the educational environment. The JST also will tell you, it has like an ACE mapping to it. So it'll tell you the ACE code and map the equivalency as far as the level of education for that topic. So, how can schools sort of shift their framework to treat the JST as a diagnostic tool for long term success, and for goal pathing when it comes to career outcomes?
Yeah, I think one of the first things is I love the way that you ask, particularly how can it work to sort of like goal pathing, right? That's a subtle, but I think a important distinction because on its own and by itself, a JST is actually retrospective, right? It's looking back, which is important in some ways of what has happened, but the actual component that provides true meaning to those experiences is where that individual student veteran wants to go in the future, right? That future trajectory actually starts to shift and add potentially different priorities to the past experiences that are that are there. So I think more than anything, starting to look at that as a necessary component, but by itself not a fully sufficient piece to do some of those future pathway developments. I think that's really, really important. So again, your question prompts, I think, a really important shift, which is the JST is more than just, hey, okay, we can allocate X number of credits that might help somebody along. Yes, it can do that, but more importantly, if you're looking, and again, it goes back to some of those initial sort of conversations with enrollment managers and that admissions team to be able to highlight, hey, here are some potential future outcomes that are there. In our business school at William and Mary, we have the fortunate aspect that our broad cohort sizes are small enough that we can manage that in a really, really sort of personal manner. So I provide, from like that military expertise perspective, some of that supporting expertise and perspective to our admissions team. So as candidates move along through the interview sort of process, I'm able to participate in that and then start to draw out some of those potential trajectories that those conversations have. I think an intentional means, and again, we're able to use my office here in the Mason School, but there's other means to do that in other institutions. But in many ways, it's starting to bring conversations, staff-based conversations between career advising and admissions closer together. And as you do so, again, the JSC is a great place to start, but that's another way to sort of essentially integrate that experience to the known sort of set sort of curriculum and curriculum options that a student might have, and to start those questions and start those discussions, particularly with the student, sooner rather than later. You can identify different components. If experiences were just sort of less sort of technical or quantitative in their sense, and it's a STEM designated sort of MBA program, okay, even before they start, are there additional resources that we can use that actually start to build confidence? And that's an important piece, particularly when you're looking at transitioning service members, right? You're entering a deeply uncertain world that's fraught with realities such as transition stress. Earlier conversations that recognize that experience, but then also are providing advice of how you can augment that experience with, again, this educational opportunity. I think that's a really important piece that each institution probably has to work out in their own way, but that's a really important principle to follow.
Absolutely. You brought up a lot of great points. I could go on forever on this topic. Um, I just want to note that like it can also be a great way to help answer the question, like, I don't know what I want to do, right? And you can look at the JST and it has the ACE equivalencies right next to it, right? And so
Mhm.
you can ask someone, was this something that you enjoyed or something that you didn't enjoy? And then tie that right back to ACE, and then you understand, okay, this part of the degree may be where we need to build a little bit more confidence, right? Or focus on career outcomes that maybe don't have such an emphasis on this area. So to your point earlier, it's been a great way to sort of build that communication moving forward, especially when you're bridging the gap between career and admission.
Absolutely. I think that's a really important part because it can also start to introduce them to different sort of academic techniques that they're going to see as well. So one of the things we do, we sort of refer to it as simply the good time journal. That when you look at different elements of a JST, some of my sessions with those student veterans are actually saying, okay, hey, in any given week, what were some of the activities that you were looking at? And then we have them evaluate them on sort of two different dials, if you will. One was how deeply engaged they were. And the second piece is what was just sort of like the feedback from that activity itself. Was it positive? Was it neutral? Was it negative? And we're able to highlight that if they're deeply engaged in something and it's a positive feedback, well, we introduce this idea of flow state, right? Our organizational behavior course talks about flow state. It talks about the elements that keep employees deeply engaged in their work. And typically in a business school, that's the perspective. But the social science is the same to apply that question to yourself. And then we're able to introduce that to the student of then just sort of saying, hey, at what circumstances, what conditions did you need to really operate at your most fulfilled, your most productive, as well as your most resilient? And that's a far more sort of comprehensive way to have emotional wellness emotional well-being, and career wellness is actually an element of that too, that could really help with cultural alignment, strength alignment, and again, finding that right fit even as early as potentially as an internship. And to be able to use the same language that some of our professors do as well, I think is deeply intentional as well as deeply effective in terms of being able to introduce some of those ideas and tools that they can apply to themselves as they start this educational and simultaneously this employment search experience.
Absolutely. And how do you guys do this really, really well? So how do you feel that everything that you're doing from bridging that landscape between admissions and career is affecting your student retention metrics? Do you feel like, and in what ways?
Yeah, I think it's helping student retention massively, right? Particularly, it is starting to normalize relationships in a brand new setting in terms of higher education, right? Because at the same time, by taking an idea that in taking an idea that a certain professor is going to use later in the semester, and we're introducing that and essentially during the orientation weeks, it allows a little bit of additional time for student veterans to get their heads wrapped around some of those ideas. And we even bring in those professors to the orientation week. And by making those introductions, another key thing that we emphasize is that from the professor perspective, yes, these are human beings that will be able to provide you specific technical skills, but professionally, they're also important relationships to develop too. And developing sort of like this relational mindset makes interactions less transactional. And it also starts to open them up to other relationships, which are going to be so critical in that career search. So we start to then coach from a networking perspective from the very beginning. Students should have coaches, right? They should have and professors can sometimes feel that coaching role that's very task and skill sort of oriented. They should have mentors, which is a separate program that we're able to provide for them here at William and Mary. In terms of, we call them executive partners, and they're retired C-suite executives that have retired to the area, and they provide broad sort of mentorship guidance. But then we use those two types of relationships to then say, hey, let's start to find some folks in specific companies and specific industries that might not be a coach, they might not be a mentor, but they could very well be an advocate for you. And that advocate then leads to referrals. Referrals then greatly increasing the probability of an interview. And then using those interviews and all those relationships to prepare for those interviews. That's what we think, particularly in this very, very fraught and complicated job and labor market, is sort of a pathway to success, not only now, but in the future. Because when you're looking for those advocates early on, they could provide the referral to start that path. Later on, who's the advocate in a civilian organization that's really going to be a proponent and an advocate for that individual for future promotion and future growth as well?
One of my favorite saying is your network is your net worth.
It absolutely is. And that process doesn't have to feel icky as well. And that's the other element of just sort of like normalizing this process that we're deeply intentional about at the same time. Really, and we've started to actually develop, we have an additional week of orientation just for our military connected students. And that orientation, it focuses first on their values. It moves from values to interest, which is a really good scientific, really, a social science based way to look at motivation. After values and interests, we use elements of Clifton Strengths Finder. We bring in one of our management professors that they will have later in their experience here. He walks them through their strengths, and then they're already, even before starting a single official course, they're able to talk about interest and skills with a different sort of language that's there as well. We then proceed and talk about relationships, right? Relationships then grow into networks, but that's a very sort of intentional series of steps that we do at the very, very beginning, and we do it with career outcomes in mind. In mind as well, and I think that's another important aspect, particularly in this job market. It provides additional time Time is a key element that's there, so they can start to think about potential trajectories before they jump into their initial coursework, right? Because that's sort of like a cold splash of water in the face as well when you're managing data analytics. You have this long gap in terms of the last time you probably did some serious math. And again, it allows us to provide additional resources to get over each of those different sort of challenges in sequence.
Absolutely. And the labor market is just getting more and more competitive. That some insight from the Military Friendly Employer Survey. The top ways that military friendly employers source military connected talent is through word of mouth and network referrals. And
Yeah.
so you're staying ahead of the game, right? There's a lot of technology and AI tools that are put on the back end of employee CRM systems, and applicant tracking systems that can weed out qualified talent just based on keywords that are within the resume that don't align or match with a requisition. An example of that would be like management versus leadership.
Hmm.
On a requisition, a lot of times you will see the word management. What they're looking for is leadership skills. And AI search. Um, my next question to you is looking at someone who maybe has an MOS code that is not commonly found in the civilian working environment, or experience that isn't common, right? Or maybe they have an armament or combat background. Taking a look at that JST and how those skills directly align, how do you use some of the leadership qualities or leadership abilities that they have to improve your programs across campus or to improve the relationships between individuals? And sort of building that confidence with others so that more people can take on more leadership skills and leadership roles within either programs, initiatives, or networking.
Yeah, in some ways, we're the beneficiaries, particularly, and our student veterans are the beneficiaries of a team-based sort of learning model that we use really within the first sort of 3 quarters of the first year of our MBA program. And one of the unique aspects of that, in years past, teams have ranged from 4 to 5 students. One student will sometimes be an active duty officer that's on a federally funded broadening educational experience. One will be a veteran. One will be a civilian that will have between 3 to 5 years of work experience. There could be an international student in there, and maybe a civilian student straight out of undergrad. And just providing that new sort of dynamics of in that case 5 really unique perspectives. One of the key things that particularly folks that might have some difficult to translate military experience, whether it's out of combat arms or that, they're so good at being able to integrate in different sort of perspectives, right? And so then the learning process actually then becomes another sort of experience process, right? Of just being able to then say, hey, I am learning to manage and integrate a cross-functional team, and that's happening in terms of an academic experience, right? But then again, that provides additional context to demonstrate, not just state that you have that skill, but to demonstrate what that skill looks like, and the ability to sometimes then highlight that, right? Some of the key elements that come into the power of being able to use LinkedIn, the power to be able to use a number of different sort of just social media approaches to not to literally visualize the academic work, which when done correctly is actually the business analytical work that's there. And you're able to have like a data visualization sort of output that's a part of a LinkedIn post, right? Or it could be a very small video capture of a very compelling presentation, right? That comes out of a communication for managers sort of class. And so one can piece those things together, whether it's on a personal website, on their LinkedIn site, to really build a much more comprehensive piece if they know the direction they're going and are getting like appropriate coaching of what are those skills and what are those capabilities that folks are looking for. But I think it's being intentional about taking folks and putting them into a new environment that bridges that gap between the military experience and their divided civilian experience that's there. And again, to do that, it requires, as we mentioned sort of earlier, this really collaborative committee-based sort of approach to say, hey, this is an opportunity of what we can do, and then literally inviting some of those corporate institutional partners into the business school to see that in person, as well as then to encourage folks to be able to broadcast that in a little bit more of a broader way.
Absolutely. The teamwork part and coming together as a group is so valuable and so important. And I feel, and in my experiences too, and I know with a lot of employers, one of the biggest trait or characteristics, right, that they look for is the ability to work as a team in any environment that you're in. And military experience brings something very unique, right? You don't get to choose who's on your team. You just
You
have to
know,
you just have to choose how you all work together and figure that out. And so I think that's a huge strength and benefit to any military student joining, the workforce, is that they bring that perspective on how do I find, the positive characteristics of each member of my team and get them to all work together for one common goal.
yeah, and I think and again, this is a key element of just broad sort of storytelling, and that as a subcomponent of communication as is really one of those important core skills for the future, right? That aspect of communication and storytelling is actually one of the designated skills for 2030, a core skill for 2030 that employers are looking for out of that study. Another key skill on that was actually creativity. And I think what's interesting and what can be really, really compelling is when you ask your average human being, do you expect the military to produce deeply creative human beings? And the answer is probably going to be no in terms of a stereotype, right? These people like walk in a formation to go eat together, right? That's not the most creative sort of like image in the world. But anyone who spent any amount of time in or around the military realizes that yeah, planning is really important, but also no plan survives first contact, right? That's just sort of known. A retired German general after World War II was being interviewed by Americans as they were worried about the onset of the Cold War and the threat of the Soviets. And they were asking him, well, who's the more effective army? Is it the Red Army, the Soviet Union? Is it the American Army? And the German simply said, I got to say it's probably the American Army because I sort of believe that war is chaos, and what it appears to me is that the American Army like practices chaos on a daily basis, right? And in the midst of that, you learn to be creative, right? Regardless of what your MOS might be. And I think that's a really important perspective that requires some storytelling, requires some intentionality to frame experiences that allow you to do that, that again bridge that piece between the storyteller and the audience that's there. But then just those two things together, you're simultaneously demonstrating an effective means of communication as well as demonstrating creativity. Again, different skills that many experts think are going to be a key component of job descriptions in the future. If you can't do that in an institution of higher education, I might just sort of give up on it, right? That's the ideal place to do it. But again, it requires some intentionality. It requires the right culture among administrators, faculty, and staff to make that a reality.
Culture is so important. Culture match is important when it comes to employment, right? So
Absolutely.
what direct correlation have you observed between providing incoming students, student veterans, and military connected students with a clear roadmap, right? You mentioned this group and having your goal set and sort of building on that. What do you want to do when you get out? Closer to when they get out. How have you seen that impact your retention, your overall goals, your student success metrics?
Yeah, we've seen that positively impact those metrics, but I think the thing that we are seeing before some of the quantifiable metrics, what we're actually seeing are sort of psychological outcomes of positivity that's there, right? I mean, there's a wonderful study out of Columbia University, out of the Teachers College there back in 2018, but actually took the time to outline and do some initial sort of surveys that outlined transition stress, right? And it put it in the context, and again, in 2018, a little bit closer to the heights of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Clear at that time, Iraq was a little bit on a downturn, still significant operations going on in Afghanistan to be sure. But it highlighted the fact that post-traumatic stress was probably affecting about 35 to 40% of combat veterans that were there. Transition stress was affecting 70% of all transition sort of service members. So when you look at just a stressor, right, it is double the incidence rate of post-traumatic stress. And it's because human beings are dealing with uncertainty. And typically human beings deal with uncertainty either by avoidance and procrastination or by control and perfectionism, right? And both of those lead to too much of they lead to greater intensity and emphasis on outcomes rather than process. And all of those can impede learning and developmental processes as well. So the initial things that we're seeing from some of our approaches is actually just better positive reactions, better feedback from the experience itself, which is actually then increasing confidence. And if you have increasing confidence as you're going into this uncertain sort of piece, you're actually then performing better in interviews. You're performing better in a new situation that is even than an internship, which by definition is probably like a 12 to 16 week interview, right? And so those are some of the key things that we're seeing as well. And in addition to that, in each of those events, whether it is a career fair prep, whether it is an internship, we're trying to get feedback from the students themselves. So during the summer internships, our rising second year MBAs, this is the time of the summer where I'm checking in with them directly. Sometimes it's with an actual site visit if it's relatively close. Sometimes it might just be a Zoom or a Teams call, but we're trying to get that feedback from them now. And then the decision starts to shift, right? If it's positive feedback, if they are feeling that that alignment exists between their values and that corporate culture, well, then we start to shift and provide some resources on what are the best ways to convert that internship to full-time employment, right? Does that affect what their second year course level looks like? Because they might be able to develop a remote work part-time opportunity while they complete that out, right? That's deeply empowering. And on the flip side, if it's not quite aligned, well, then that allows us to treat that experiential learning experience as a learning experience. It's not necessarily a failure, but we can start to do other things to continue to network if the industry is right, but the company might be not. Or if we need to totally sort of restart that career search, we start or are able to do that in July as opposed to October or the following March. And it gives us additional time to be as deeply intentional to take that input in for that student and then develop a series of options for them to start to explore in the intervening time frame.
Absolutely. And I think there's another element to that as far as like expectations, right? And managing those expectations. Someone may feel that a company's not a good culture fit because their expectations were that the company operates this way, or based on the values that they read, this is how they interpreted what it would be like in that organization, or
Right.
even a day in the life of, right? Here's what I thought I was going to be doing versus here is what I am actually doing. And I don't really like it, right? But our military students bring in, such operational maturity, and but they face so many challenges when it comes to culture shock and navigating what that corporate environment looks like, either because it's not a good fit, it's a different culture experience than they thought it was, or the job's not exactly what they thought it was going to be because those expectations weren't set. But what specific initiatives have you guys embedded in your program that really help bridge that gap in transition when it comes to the culture shock, right? You don't know everybody's rank in the room when you walk in. It's not written on their chest
Yeah.
or on their sleeve, right? So how do you prepare them for that?
Yeah, we prepare them. That team-based learning model helps to a degree, right? The other piece of what we do is, in addition to that pre-orientation course that I described earlier, at the tail end of that, we also then put them into sort of a curated mentorship program with William and Mary alumni as well. So they'll finish that orientation program right before their MBA orientation. So that's happening in early August. We take those inputs, and then when homecoming happens at William and Mary, we use that as an actual event, a physical event to make introductions that then create virtual based virtual-based mentorship relationships. So once somebody has decided on a couple of different trajectories they want to explore, we use that mentorship sort of perspective of somebody that's in either the same company or at least the same industry to start to try and fill in some of those gaps. And so they can share their own experience if they're a veteran themselves, what that culture shock experience felt like, or if they're not a veteran, but somebody who is in that clear realm of being an ally, to be able to provide, hey, here are some other sort of conversations I've had with others, or here are how I have seen others navigate this well, and other sort of points of contact and relationships that can exist from there too. And the other piece that we try to do within that mentorship program is before each monthly call, we frame it and with some short video instruction. And we have one video for the mentors, so they can sort of understand what the other half of that relationship is experiencing at that time, and what they might be looking for. And then we also have it structured, so a learning objective of that is really for the student. How can I be a better protege or a mentee, right? What are some specific questions I can ask that, again, deal with that aspect of cultural alignment, cultural fit? That's one of the specific sort of mentorship conversations that we have. And we time that towards the end of the program. So that's like an April-based conversation. So based off that conversation, they can either connect with others, they can do some other sort of preparation, just mental preparation of, hey, how are some different sort of techniques I can either practice and start to apply of an internship that will probably start sometime in June.
So in that tracking window, right? I mean, it's a pretty short window, 180 days worth of graduation, but mentorship can be a great way to intervene,
Mhm.
at that point. But are there any other tactics or initiatives that you guys are taking during that final semester to, or even in that compressed timeline, to help with the job placement rates or positive student outcomes?
Yeah, on that, we've done a couple of different sort of pieces, right? So in some ways, we have formed with different sort of companies specific internship pipelines. So one of them, when we look for regional companies that were there, we aligned those companies with industries that were indicating growth, right? You know, you look at some of the different sort of jobs reports. The recent jobs reports have really, the jobs gains have come either in the energy industry, particularly as it associates around data center production, data center support, or healthcare, right? So we looked at that data, and then we went to some regional partners that were already existing with very strong relationships with the university and the business school. And then we also happened to discover with one of them, they had a wonderful undergraduate student pipeline, but they didn't have an MBA student pipeline. So then we make the value proposition, particularly from the student veteran perspective, is, hey, if you get MBA student veterans, they can help you manage some of the other interns that you have there, right? That's a wonderful way to take some of those leadership skills we were discussing earlier and apply it in a new situation, as well as it mitigates some of the concerns. Because I know what's real in terms of a hiring manager or a manager in a corporation, like, hey, interns are great, but do I need to teach somebody how to adult, right? You know, am I, by the time I sort of help them train up to learn this particular sort of task, they're going to go back to school and those components. When we can put that in the student veteran perspective, where no, you don't have to teach them to adult, right? They know how to show up on time, right? You might not have to tell them what's okay to wear, but we can deal that, we can work around that. And one of the student veteran superpower, and it's a superpower of all veterans and transitioning service members, is the ability to learn things rapidly, sometimes random, very specific things rapidly. And then that way we are gaining a deeper understanding and a deeper relationship with specific companies that are, again, agreeing to some of these pipelines. And it's working. And in some cases, to be deeply intentional on that, it's a wonderful sort of safety net when you look at the other career hiring challenges, which are an absolute reality for MBA interns and MBA graduates right now.
Absolutely. To the when it comes to your career services office on
Mhm.
campus, and I think this is more for like your traditional four-year or your undergrad, and maybe a little bit of grad school too, but you in grad school you have a little bit of a different demographic, right? Some have work experience, some have already kind of been out there, done things, been there, done that, versus your non-traditional or versus your traditional students. But how have you prepared your career services office to handle the military student, right? They come in with a different perspective. They're not your traditional 18-year-old coming in. It's their first time in as an intern. A lot of the individuals coming in have already managed millions of dollars in military assets, or thousands of people, or hundreds of people, or even a handful, but they have been in real world situations, already doing jobs. Um, how have you customized that training for career services so that they're able to accommodate to that? And how have you customized the program? I know that's a lot I just threw at you,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. So in terms of the training that's there, we have, and it's one of the training modules that I sort of lead, with the audience being those career service advisors specifically. We call it our green zone training, right? And it's a basic military cultural competency training. That's a component of that, just so they can get a little bit of what military 101 looks like. And then specifically, the way our current structure is, it's sort of each of our advisors have a certain number of students that they advise. So our advisors are basically generalists. We use our most senior advisor to work with our student veterans that are there. So again, it is a little bit of curated, specific training for them, and then we're intentional about who is providing that advice, and in the manner in which we're providing that career advice. I actually have a role, and my team has a role in that as well. So the division of labor ends up being that our Center for Military Transition focuses on aspects of relationship development, that skill, interest, cultural alignment piece, and networking sort of advice. So I work with the students on that component, and then the career advisor focuses in on some of the nuts and bolts of resume preparation, cover letter preparation, application preparation, in those components as well. So we are actually intentionally sort of doubling up resources for that student veteran population within the broader piece too. And we're even manifesting that we're doubling up their opportunities to go to different career fairs. One of the huge career fairs, we actually schedule class drops within our MBA program to allow the entire MBA class to go to the National Black MBA Association job fair. It is probably the best in the world for that. It's usually happening in late September, and we provide stipends for student veterans to be able to go to that. And we also then have them go to the MBA Veterans Conference as well. And we also encourage them, there's a couple of other organizations pretty familiar with that, have virtual career conferences on that too. So for a student veteran experience, they will have a career advisor, they'll have a Center for Military Transition support and advisor on that. And they're going to be going to at least two in person, as well as at least one, if not more, virtual career events as well. It's that intentional redundancy which I think is necessary. And we're seeing that's what we're correlating with some of the positive career outcomes that we're seeing as well.
well, I absolutely love everything that William and Mary is doing and that your office has done to support the university. In closing, I have another question for you, and this will be our final question before we jump into QA. But you mentioned earlier about your alumni network and the strengthened relationships that you have with that alumni network. How do you feel that giving your students raw exposure to that alumni network has strengthened their outcomes in the civilian workplace?
Um, I, the I think the best way to sort of describe that is by starting with safe initial steps in terms of relationships, right? This very, very strong sort of common experience. We're essentially helping those student veterans learn a skill. We're not just providing them a connection, right? We're helping them learn. We're not giving them a seafood dinner. We're teaching them how to fish in that way in a very, very intentional sort of manner. That I think is the key aspect to think about it, because it does a couple of things. A, it makes the relationships more authentic. B, that authenticity then reduces the ickiness of what a lot of veterans will react to when they hear the word networking. And C, it's a wonderful way to sort of scale our capacity on that too. The important caveat that we do with that is that we're also sort of trying to teach our student veterans to look at how relationships can naturally align, right? The benefit of being a graduate school, we can highlight to them, okay, hey, what ties might you have with a certain organization that line up with your military service, your undergraduate experience, and now William and Mary, right? If you get two of those sort of components together, that's automatically from the word go a stronger and deeper relationship that's there. So when we introduce our alumni, we don't make it exclusively veteran, but we make it concentrated enough with some of our veteran alumni where we already have two of those really, really strong, similar experience bases that those relationships can start with. And then we always encourage that final question of one of those initial sort of sessions to be, who else would you recommend that I talk to? And then that relationship building, that network building isn't additive; it becomes a multiplication problem, right? It is starting to then actually be multiplicative in its effect and have some compounding effects from there as well. But we're really intentional about teaching them of like, hey, when we're looking at different organizations, where are the William and Mary folks that are there? Where are the William and Mary folks that have military ties that are there? And then where are some of those other military ties that are there as well? And I think that helps to, again, allow someone to be creative, give someone more resources, and empower them more in this very sort of uncertain, transitory time that they're going through.
Absolutely. And, at William and Mary, you guys really have built a strong supportive environment from the beginning that student starts to, you know, when they become alumni, right? And I feel like the amount of effort and intention that you've put into that program really is what has catapulted the support that you have from your alumni network. They've had a positive experience and want to pay it forward moving forward. So hats off to you guys and your team
Thank you. Yeah.
for creating such an awesome program. Uh, we have a couple questions in the Q&A
Yeah.
that I just want to get to. So someone has asked, does William and Mary have a veteran resource center? And if so, how is it funded?
Yeah, we do have a veteran resource center. All of our funding for our veteran resource center outside of our school certifying official is deeply, deeply supported by philanthropic funds on that as well. And so I sort of provide a lot of those wraparound services for graduate business student veterans. That's why my outpost, if you will, is in our business school. I have a counterpart that works in the University Student Affairs. He's in our Office of Student Veteran Engagement, so he primarily focuses on some of our undergraduate student veterans. We have a benefits clinic that's in our law school, and they provide sort of assistance on that as well. And that's sort of like across the university. And then in the Office of the University President, we have a special assistant to the university president, as well as a strategic and engagements manager and director, actually a director level role there in the university president's office to broadly coordinate these other outposts that are there. Again, the majority of our funding does come from philanthropic support that's there. But as an example of like the funding for my center, about 60% of it comes from the business school itself, and then 40% of it comes from some of that additional philanthropic funding. And again, that's inside institutions. That is a huge piece to be aware of and to constantly sort of manage. And each institution will be different.
Absolutely. The next question is, okay, so the top degrees list, that is published through GI Jobs Magazine, and we will share a link to the DigiMag for you right in the chat. Also, the resource that JD mentioned earlier about the virtual career fairs, we do host virtual career fairs that are available for your students every month. So we will put two links in the chat for you guys so that you have access to that information. And the last question that we have here, JD, is if an institution is just getting started, right, in their veteran programs, what do you recommend that they start with, or what are those top three things that they can sort of get their feet wet in?
Yeah. So the top thing is to establish a framework to be able to listen to the student veterans themselves at that institution, right? I can think I might have like a great idea. A student veteran very, very rapidly in the wonderful way that they can, the only way that they can probably, will tell me whether that idea is great or less than. So I think that is absolutely critical. The other element that it does, because again, I think we have to be candid and acknowledge that oftentimes student veterans can feel like they are fish out of water in higher education, is by giving them a voice and a platform. That in and of itself is experiential learning, and that in and of itself is deeply, deeply empowering. So again, listening and being student veteran centric as a principle as well as an initial act is the first thing that I would recommend. The second thing that I would recommend would be taking a slightly different committee functional approach to building some of those systems. And what I mean by that is you can do a lot of interesting double work of finding a like university veteran employees that are there, but then also thinking through some of the functions we've been talking about here, the functions of admissions and enrollment, right? On the other end of the student experience piece, bring together the functions of career advising and employment, right? And then what is in the middle of that? Student support on the staff side, faculty support on that as well. The school certifying official to make sure that the VA benefits are being delivered with a degree of efficiency, timeliness, and completeness with as little friction as possible. So to think through then on the committee that is then providing recommendations to this, it has an adequate aspect of student veteran voice itself, but then all these different sort of functional requirements that committee then becomes a cross-functional team that's actually trying to provide the best comprehensive solutions to a really complex problem and opportunity at the same time to be able to move forward in that too. So those would be my top two pieces of advice. Listen to the student veterans and be deeply intentional and have a functional mindset of the committees and the teams that you build to explore how these different components work. That's generally the model that occurred before I arrived at William and Mary. I have the honor of being the inaugural executive director of our center, but the folks that came before me were very, very intentional about thinking about different functions. One of the conclusions they rapidly came to was that the needs and opportunities that undergraduate student veterans have were distinctly different than the needs that graduate student veterans have. I think that's an important sort of distinction. Kayla, you sort of mentioned it itself, the employment dynamics of that are just vastly different. And so it makes sense to then take those insights and build those components. That's again why we have an office that's in part of student affairs and helps to integrate undergraduate students in. That complements the work that what my office and my center does in terms of bringing them in, integrating them, but then also helping them on the way out. And so that's the result of how we determined and garner those insights that resulted in that sort of structural piece. That will vary from institution to institution, program to program, but I think that's the best way to start to explore those things. That's a great question.
JD, you are a wealth of knowledge. Uh, I just want to say a big thank you to you for.
Absolutely. Always my pleasure.
Don't worry, it won't be the last time. So we will have you back again to pick your brain. And for all of you out there joining us today, thank you for spending some time with us. We hope that you found today's information valuable. If you are interested in learning more about how memberships can help assist your organization and you are ready to recruit military students, feel free to give that QR code up on your screen a scan and book a discovery call with one of our experts. Again, thank you so much, JD. We appreciate you being here, and thank you so much for sharing all of the wonderful things William and Mary is doing to support the military community.
My absolute pleasure. Always a pleasure to collaborate with this team, and it is absolute honor. So thank you.
We appreciate you guys. Have a great one.